Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. Sanctions-ridden Iran has asked International Monetary Fund for $5 billion to fight the coronavirus spread. The outbreak has hit the Islamic Republic hard, Iran's Foreign Minister Mohammad Zarif said on Thursday. The escalating outbreak in Iran, the worst affected country in the Middle East, has killed 429 people and infected 10,075 so far. These are the registered cases. The outbreak has damaged already fledgling Iranian businesses and is bound to hit its non-oil exports after many neighboring countries and trade partners shut their borders. Zarif said in a tweet that the IMF managing director has already stated that countries affected by COVID-19 will be supported via rapid financial instrument. Our central bank requested access to this facility immediately, unquote. Zarif's request is very interesting and adds a completely new dimension to geopolitics. The question for the US would be, would it, can it, should it lean on the IMF to deny Tehran this request to help the Iranian people? The World Health Organization has already declared the outbreak a pandemic. The United States itself is under threat. On Thursday, it surpassed 1,600 confirmed or presumptive cases of the coronavirus, and the death toll climbed to 41. Wall Street recorded historic losses as fears intensified over the economic fallout from the pandemic. The Dow Jones Industrial Average fell by 10%, and the Nasdaq and the S&P 500 both went down by 9%. In Europe, Italy, Denmark, and Ireland have already enforced nationwide lockdowns. Is this a situation in which conventional exercise of geopolitics needs to be put in abeyance? Or would the US use this opportunity in the traditional framework to put further pressure on Iran? On the traditional side of things, Iran has gradually begun walking back from the nuclear deal and has stopped sharing nuclear sites information with the International Atomic Energy Agency. This is in line with its declarations with reference to JCPOA, which, for all practical purposes, is in the intensive care now. To discuss this, we have with us Dr. Vaqar Ahmed, who is Joint Executive Director, Sustainable Development Policy Institute in Islamabad. We also have with us Seyed Mohammad Marandi, who is a political and strategic affairs analyst and joins us from Tehran. And we are also joined by Dr. Christian Kaunert, who's Chair of Policing and Security, as well as Director of the International Center for Policing and Security at the University of South Wales. Thank you to all three panelists. Let me begin with Dr. Ahmed here. Dr. Ahmed, give us a sense of the global economic slowdown that is being caused by this pandemic. The various sectors, whether it's aviation industry, whether it's entertainment, tourism, and now with closure of borders, and of course, also the internal economy is slowing down. What kind of impact are we looking at?
I think it is important, and particularly for the developing countries, to understand the various transmission channels through which this pandemic is impacting or going to impact their economy. You talked of Iran seeking help from IMF. It's just a matter of time that many other developing countries who are not in a position to cope with this situation would also end up taking the same position. To start with, I think we are looking at a very adverse impact on trade flows. Already you have seen that containers containing industrial inputs to several developing countries have been stopped. There is an embargo on, for example, industrial raw material going from China to various countries been stopped, and one is going to see a slump in production and, of course, export receipts as well. Going forward, of course, the impact on labor migration and remittance, which is a significant inflow for developing countries, is also going to be hurt. While, of course, a labor movement from developing countries has been put on hold because of the adverse travel advisory by several developed countries. But it is also noteworthy to mention that the labor which actually resides in many of the donor countries, from where the remittance flows has to come, that labor will also be affected due to the global meltdown.
Let me go to Syed Mohammad Marandi here. Mr. Marandi, as I said in my opening, this is sort of interesting in the sense that we have the United States, which is not the only country, but the lead country in the IMF, which has put Iran under primary and secondary sanctions, which is, of course, the traditional geopolitical, framework in and through which the U.S. operates. But now, given what the IMF managing director said, and given the nature of what's happening now, which is probably one of the most important disruptive elements that the world has seen, if not before, at least recently, what exactly is Iran expecting here? Do you think that the U.S. would use the traditional framework, put Tehran under pressure, or perhaps take a different approach?
Well, if we look at history, the United States will use any means to hurt its adversary. We saw, for example, after the United States pushed Iraq out of Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, the same Saddam Hussein, of course, that the United States and the Europeans earlier on equipped with chemical weapons. But when they expelled him from Kuwait, they imposed sanctions on the country that ultimately killed 1 million people. And when a reporter asked the then U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright if 500,000 dead Iraqi children were worth it, she said yes, they were worth it. So this is how the United States functions. With regards to Iran, the United States has been as brutal and as inhumane and as barbaric as possible. The sanctions that are currently in place are there to prevent Iran from importing medicine, which is effectively what the United States has been doing. They have not allowed a single euro worth of medicine to be purchased through the international financial sector. And they constantly try to block all other means through which Iran does trade. So the United States has put a great deal of pressure on pharmaceutical companies across the world. In Korea more recently, a lot of pressure is being put on them not to cooperate with Iran. And that is why the Koreans have also, alongside the Europeans and North American companies, they've discontinued cooperation with Iran.
So Mr. Marandi, let me, this sort of historical trajectory that you're talking about is, of course, based on facts. What you said about Ms. Albright is also a fact. But those were situations in which traditional realpolitik could work. Now, this is something which has taken hold of, it's a global thing. It's a pandemic. It's not just about a single country. This is the kind of thing that requires cooperation across the globe. Do you still believe that despite this new dimension of the problem, that the U.S. would still sail close to its own sort of, geopolitical groups?
What you say is completely logical, because this virus, the coronavirus, does not recognize international borders. And although the Americans and Europeans and many think tank people and government officials were seen gloating about the problems that Iran has had with the coronavirus, we have still, until this moment, we still continue to see the same inhumane sanctions being implemented with full force, both by the United States and by extension by the subordination of Europeans and other countries close to the United States. So until now, we have seen no change in policy, but this is a policy that will ultimately not just kill Iranians, which is the intention of the United States, but also it will begin to kill other people because, as I said, this virus does not know borders.
Absolutely. That was my point, because, the likelihood of a spread to Vaqar, Ahmed, this, I was talking about the global economic slowdown, also the internal economic slowdowns in not just the developing countries, but also in the developed countries. We've seen Italy under lockdown. There are going to be complete revisions of figures and growth rates if heaven forbid this goes any further, which according to all estimates, that is likely to happen. So what kind of economic picture are we looking at in terms of this slowdown?
So, Ejaz, the two things are imminent. First, of course, is that there is going to be worsening of a balance of trade. You have seen that in case of several Middle Eastern countries, particularly those who are oil-producing nations. So we are seeing their balance of payments position deteriorating given the low and projected low oil prices in the coming days. The second key issue is that those economies which are heavily dependent on commodities and are seeing lower commodity prices in general are also going to be a casualty. But I think if one translates it for developing economies, two channels are important here. One is that already several poorer countries are looking at exchange rate pressures. So if you look at Pakistan, for example, you have seen Pakistani rupee shed almost 4 rupees in the past week. Now, this exchange rate pressure essentially brings in additional inflationary concerns. And as inflation escalates, of course, this is going to be harder for the poorest quintile to actually absorb this shock. Now, the response of the government would naturally have to be in terms of expanding the social safety nets. Now, the government can only do that if they have very decent tax or non-tax revenues, which, for example, if you look at an economy like Pakistan, we are already in a situation where we haven't been able to meet our recent tax targets committed with the IMF, for example. So all in all, you're looking at the second
So in this case, I mean, if this is going to be, like as I said, the economic slowdown, or even in the developed countries. Now, if we look at the Iranian case, which is, as I said in my opening, already under extremely stringent primary and secondary sanctions, what kind of picture can you draw? And as I asked Mr. Marandi also, what is the likelihood of the IMF actually granting Iran the $5 billion facility to which Iran has requested?
Ejaz, I'll go back to the conclusion and the statement by the Director General of WHO. I think he's right in saying that fighting this pandemic requires a global partnership. Unless we actually implement this statement in letter and spirit, we are coming out of this challenge. And no country, this has to be treated as a global systemic concern. No country is going to do this on its own. There has to be a redistribution of resources from the developed to the developing or countries who are challenged with this pandemic relatively more than others, for example. There has to be a flow of resources to these economies to help them out, most notably, of course, Iran. Countries in Europe, for example, who would need help.
So you're basically saying that a time for traditional realpolitik is up. Thank you so much. That was Dr. Vaqar Ahmed speaking with us. Let me go to Dr. Kaunert here. Dr. Kaunert, the same question to you. I mean, is this time for traditional geopolitics, or do you think we need to sort of, take a pause, hit the pause button on that and think anew in terms of this global security threat?
Yes. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Of course, the coronavirus is something quite special. It is one of the gravest public health crises across the globe for probably centuries. It will cause enormous harm in the sense that many people will die. It will cause a lot of security issues as it, in a sense, jumps across different borders. And I think that is what is making it a truly transnational security threat in a way that we may not have seen so many other threats before. Now, as a result of that, I think obviously the global response should be coordinated as much as possible. And there should be, in a way, like you say, the kind of geopolitical dimension should take a back step. And in a sense, we should be moving towards containing this virus as much as possibly can be achieved. Is that necessarily going to happen? Well, if we look at the travel ban on Europeans, it was very clearly seen that the White House perceived to send a political message to Europe that, Britain is a part. So I wouldn't be totally convinced that geopolitics is going to stay out of this. But of course, as an aspiration, it should.
So there is a possibility that instead of having a coordinated global response, we actually, ironically, headed towards isolationism. But let me go back to Mr. Marandi here. Mr. Marandi, the other issue on the table is, of course, this IAEA concern. Now, as I said in my opening, the JCPOA, the technical name for the nuclear deal with Iran, is already in the intensive care unit, frankly. I mean, much before this coronavirus hit and put people in the ICUs, the JCPOA is there. So what exactly are we looking at there?
Well, just a couple of things I'd like to add before responding to your question, and that is that we have to keep in mind that the IMF does not belong to the United States. And for Iran to get a loan from the IMF, no one is doing it any favors. Iran has always been paying its share, and it has not received any loan from the IMF for decades. So this is the right of the Iranians to be able to access it, just as it is the right of Iranians to do trade with countries that they want. But U.S. hegemony is as such that you either must obey the United States or you will be punished. And the Europeans, despite what the Americans just did with regards to the flights, despite the fact that the U.S. government treats the Europeans with impunity, they continue to obey the United States. That's why at the moment I'm not convinced that there will be any major shift in U.S. policy. With regards to the JCPOA, we have to remember that it was the United States that exited the agreement.
Yeah.
Not only did it exit the agreement, but it began to bully the Europeans and other countries to leave the agreement and to ignore the agreement. Thus, the European Union has been in violation of every single commitment within the nuclear deal. For a year and a half, despite the violation of the deal by the Europeans and, of course, the United States, the Iranians continue to implement the deal in full by itself. But after a year and a half, the Iranians, in order to put pressure on the Europeans to start abiding by their commitments, the Iranians began to decrease its commitments to the deal, to decrease the application of those commitments. And we've reached where we are today because that what Iran did brought about no change in European policy. The Europeans continue to violate the agreement, and therefore the Iranians no longer feel obliged to commit themselves to the deal, although the Iranians have not left the agreement, and they have said repeatedly that if the Europeans begin to implement their side of the bargain, the Iranians will do so immediately as well. So
yeah, Iran's position is very clear on that, and Iran has been reiterating that. Also, I need to wrap up this segment also, but quickly back to Dr. Kaunert here. Dr. Kaunert, what Mr. Marandi is saying is logical. Iran abided by this, and then when President Trump came in, he decided to reopen the essential basic postulates on which the treaty and agreement was signed. So give me a sense of, from the perspective of Europe, give me a sense of the kind of sort of lopsided relationship that the Europeans have with the United States. There are, of course, solid reasons for that, but at some point, Europe needs to become the adult in the room.
Well, I think there's two things. Of course, it is right that President Trump left the agreement. He was always against the agreement from the beginning. So in that sense, he did nothing that was needed in order to push forward the agreement. But it is obviously also important to say that elements of the agreement, like not having nuclear weapons, is of course an international legal obligation on Iran, irrespective of the agreement. So we need to be a little bit careful how far we go down.
But Iran has always been saying that the program is for peaceful purposes. But I take your point. I mean, you're talking about the normative part of it, but there are also security issues here which need to be discussed. But carry on. You got another minute before I wrap up this segment.
With regards to Europe, I think at the moment we have a relatively conflictual relationship. It is primarily because of President Trump and his relationship that he sees with the European Union, that he sees with individual countries, particularly Germany, but possibly also with others, and him taking Britain a little bit apart. However, a potential future President Joe Biden might see that very differently, and I think we're getting to the point where this is becoming an increasing
Okay, thank you so much, Seyed, Mohammad, Marandi, and Dr. Christian Kaunert for speaking with us. We shall take a short break and return to discuss Turkey's near agreement with Russia and Idlib. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. We now go to Turkey and Russia's near agreement on Idlib. Turkey and Russia have largely agreed on details of a ceasefire deal in Syria's Idlib province. This was stated by Turkish Defense Minister Hulusi Akar on Thursday, the third day of discussions between the two countries. Turkey and Russia back opposing sides in Syria's war. The agreement seeks to halt an escalation of violence in Idlib that has displaced nearly 1 million people and brought the two countries close to direct confrontation. Under the agreement, more I would say modus vivendi, Turkish and Russian forces will carry out joint patrols along the strategic M4 highway linking Syria's east and west and establish a security corridor either side of it. The Sherpas on both sides are working to follow up on the bipartisan protocol over Idlib the Russian President Vladimir Putin and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan signed in Moscow on 5th March. This is yet another effort by both sides to try and come to an agreement. But their interests and positions in Syria are near irreconcilable. Where is the situation headed? From here is what we shall discuss today. And we have with us Dr. Hakki, who's a political analyst and instructor at Ibn Khaldun University in Istanbul. We also have with us Mr. Yahya Alaridi, who is a representative for the Syrian Negotiations Committee. Thank you to both panelists here. Let me begin with Dr. Ocal. Dr. Ocal, Turkey-Russia relations are very interesting at one level in the sense that there are areas of convergence. There's, of course, the S-400 purchase. There's the Black Sea pipeline. And, of course, bilateral trade and the rest of it. But in Syria, there have been serious problems. And it's not the first time that the two sides have come fairly close to a direct confrontation. Give me a sense of how you look at this near agreement, as I called it, and frankly, as I said, this is more like a modus vivendi than an agreement that's likely to hold.
Your summary was very good. I mean, this is the situation exactly. When you look at the overall relationship between Russia and Turkey, you see that it's some sort of new budding alliance between two countries. And what happened in Syria, in Idlib in particular, for the last 3 weeks, it is hard to believe that these two countries are actually talking to each other at all, let alone forming some sort of alliance. The reason is that, from my perspective, Russian side is taking side with Syria and thinking that the people in Idlib, most of them are terrorists, and they are some sort of in action against Syrian official regime forces. And Turkey, as Turkey accepted in the Idlib agreement 3 months ago, is not doing what she was supposed to do. Yes, some people in Idlib are terrorists. Hashd Shabi group mainly is a terrorist group, but they have been none whatsoever attacking any Syrian power or anything unless provoked by the Syrian powers. The Syrian regime or Syrian government soldiers are started all of a sudden, out of blue, attacking those armed opposition groups contained in Idlib, and of course, they have guns and they have everything, and they are armed resistance groups, and they responded to the Syrian regime. And Turkey, with only 9 observation points, with a limited force, could not do anything else other than asking Russia, through Russia to Syria to stop those fighting with the armed groups. However, Syria didn't stop, and somehow Putin didn't do anything about that. And unfortunately, at one point, Turkey, after one night, there was 33 Turkish soldiers killed in one swap by the Syrian forces. So Turkey had to enter Syria with force. And
Dr. Ocal, I proceed here. Sir, what you're saying, of course, this is the chronology of events, and we've actually been doing programs on this, and all of this is fairly well known. But here's the thing, and since you're a practitioner also, you're an academic also, I just want to draw your attention to the fact that the Syrians, the argument from Damascus side is they're operating in their own territory. Now, it depends where one stands in order to say, well, Bashar al-Assad's government is legitimate or that it's not legitimate. Now, Russia already has a position on that, so has Iran, and of course the Syrian army. Now, Turkey has, starting 2011, a very clear position on whether Bashar al-Assad's government is legitimate or not. Also, there is the issue of the refugees, which essentially means that Turkey can always invoke the international law concept of responsibility to protect. And Turkey has been focusing on that. So we now have a situation where Russia being on Bashar al-Assad's side, Turkey not accepting the legitimacy of Bashar al-Assad, they are in a situation where, despite all the agreements, despite all joint patrolling and the rest of it, it seems that these positions are not reconcilable.
This is perfectly reconcilable if you were able to go to Moscow and talk to Putin. Some sense it is and it is done. I mean, two sides are now seeing the same thing. They are on the same page. Now, let me remind everybody this unfortunate fact. 2/5 of this country is under American occupation. It is under the occupation of PKK, Turkish, Kurdish terrorists.
Well, that's another dimension, because that's dimension. I'm happy you mentioned that, because one of the reasons Turkey had problems with the U.S. was U.S. support for the PKK, plus the fact that Turkey is a NATO member. So Turkey is also a strategic ally of the United States. So there are convergences and there are divergences. For instance, Turkey asked for the Patriot system in order to dissuade the Russian Air Force from bombing Idlib. President Erdogan also was in Brussels and he demanded concrete support, and those were his words, from his NATO allies in Syria. So there are convergences with Russia, divergences with Russia, there are convergences with the US, divergences with the US. So what kind of chessboard is this, and what kind of move President Erdogan wants to make on this chessboard?
Actually, it's a very simple chessboard. You don't do anything in Idlib right now. Syria should stop doing things about Idlib, and they should concentrate on other parts of the country. And if Turkey cannot prevent any Hashdi Shabi terrorists attacking Syrian forces, then they can talk to Turkey. Right now, if you stop attacking those armed Syrian opposition groups in Idlib, they are not going to do anything. They are not going to invade any more lands or anything. They are just staying there. However, the issue with Syrian government is not this.
Okay.
They are in business of ethnic cleansing of Sunnis. That's what they are doing. I mean, there are only 4 million Sunnis left in Syria, and Bashar Assad is in the business of sweeping them out of country to Turkey, to Jordan, to Lebanon. He doesn't want any Sunnis left in the country.
So you agree with me that this is a situation where Ankara does not accept the legitimacy of Bashar al-Assad. In fact, Ankara thinks that Bashar al-Assad is committing Sunni genocide. But thank you so much. That was Dr. Hakki Ocal speaking with us. Let me go to Mr. Yahya Alaridi. Mr. Alaridi, you give me a sense of how you're looking at the situation. I mean, you've heard my questions, responses by Dr. Ocal. Give me your insights in it.
Greetings to you and to your guest, your audience. Actually, since the inception of this conflict in Syria between the people who wanted freedom and a regime that knows nothing but tyranny and aggression, the same story continues. Even in Idlib now, the regime started with the slogan, I either rule Syria or I will ruin it. Mm-hmm. And the same strategy continues. Even in Idlib now, the regime cannot live without tension, without blood, without destruction, without displacement of people.
Well, what the regime seems to have done, and I agree with you, whether to rule or otherwise ruin, but what now appears on the ground is that the regime has recaptured lots of territory that it had lost, and it's now going for the last outpost, and that happens to be Idlib.
Okay, well, I'm coming to this important point that you're raising. Those who support the regime, definitely Russia and Iran, also live the same situation. They want tension, they want the continuity of this war, under the pretext that the legitimate, quote-unquote, regime should have control over the geography of Syria. Actually, if those people who the regime, who are attacked by the regime, want the regime to liberate them, as it claims, from terrorists, they would at least flee towards the territory controlled by the regime. Instead of
fleeing to Turkey.
I mean, let me just finish this point.
Yeah.
But the direction they are fleeing to is Turkey, not the regime's area. In other words, if we consider the issue of legitimacy under which Putin interfered in Syria, Iran interfered in Syria under the pretext that they were called by a legitimate regime, we know, and the world should know, international law states that any regime that kills its own people is definitely illegitimate. And this is exactly what the regime has done over the past 9 years. Now, what is happening in Idlib now also has another pretext under which these agreements in Sochi and in Astana of de-escalation are being broken or violated. They say that there are terrorists there. Okay, Turkey said that it's going to take care of those, and they are working on it. But the regime continues to use those individuals, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the so-called Nusra, and some others, and they provoke certain things and make the regime attack the area. And the result of that is over 1 million people being displaced. Their towns, cities are destroyed. An agreement recently was signed, or between Turkey and, which is supportive of the opposition, and Russia, which is supportive of the regime. even this agreement is being violated. There were 12 points agreed upon, 12 military observation points, Turkish ones, agreed upon. And Russia, with this military capability, is helping the regime in order to embarrass Turkey and put it in the corner.
But that is precisely the point, Mr. Alaridi, I began with, and which was that I think this is a modus vivendi. It's not something that's likely to hold. But thank you so much. That was Yahya Alaridi, representative for the Syrian Negotiations Commission, speaking with us. There are convergences, as I said, but there are also divergences. And frankly, according to reports, one of the things that the Syrian army talked about, the Syrians, also the Russians have been talking about, is that the Turkish F-16s could not be intercepted because the Syrian ground air defenses at S-200, which is an old system, and they're upgrading it to S-300 PMUs. And in some cases, the Russians themselves have the upgraded S-400s on the ground, but they're not held by the Syrian army. Let's see how this unfolds, and we'll keep an eye on it because this is an unfolding situation. And of course, as I said, there might just be a pause button for everyone to hit as far as traditional geopolitics is concerned, given COVID-19. This is all for this week from Indus Special. We shall see you next Thursday at the same time. Meanwhile, for latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.